Hello YouTube, it's the Lonely Wolf again, and welcome back to my channel. So today I'm going to be doing a little bit of a discussion on the film The Joker. Okay, so I'm sure there's plenty of reviews out there at the moment, and they're probably going to be much more erudite than mine. So the reason I say that is because I don't really do a lot of film reviews. Okay, so mostly I do music on my channel. Okay, so if you're new, welcome to the Lonely Wolf. So please subscribe to my channel, especially if you want to listen to some piano covers. Then obviously stick around and maybe check out some of those. Okay, so in the discussion of Joker, I'll be focusing on a number of things. Okay, so firstly, I'll be talking about some of the influences. Okay, then I'm going to be talking a little bit about the cinematography, what I loved about that, and then I'll talk about some of the themes that go along with that. Okay, so firstly, just about myself. So I'm not necessarily, and I think that part of the success of this film is the fact that it appeals to a number of different audiences. So I think this is a film that will actually go beyond just the DC comic superhero type genre. So it's one of those films that crosses across those genres and into other type of genres that people will watch. So I think that's the key to a lot of its popularity at the moment, because it seems to be making a lot of money. It's getting a lot of positive reviews, which are the not the critic reviews. They're being a bit they're kind of middlebrow, so I'm not even going to begin to talk about that. But when it comes to the audience reviews, it seems to be a sort of consensus about the quality of this film. Alright, now with myself, I'm very, very picky about what I see. I would say that I only go to the films maybe once a year, okay, twice a year at most. Okay, so it takes a lot to try to convince me to go to a movie. Alright, so there's two cases. Either it's Star Wars, okay, so because I'm a loyal fan to that, so I'm probably going to go and see the next Star Wars film. And then if there's something else, if I've seen a trailer and I think, wow, I was really, really impressed. So I've seen who the actor is and I get a sense of what the film might be. So I thought, this is going to be different. So I've never actually watched a lot of the DC comic books. Like maybe the 90s I watched the Batman when it was Danny DeVito as the Penguin. Okay, that's pretty much the extent of my knowledge. But apart from that, I'm removed from that. Okay, so this film is actually different from all those other films where there's a lot of CGI action. Okay, so this one's more of a character study. Okay, and it also reminds me a lot of art house films. So people who enjoy psychological thrillers, they enjoy character studies. Okay, they enjoy a lot of those film festival type things. So it did do very well at a Venice Film Festival. Okay, it won a number of awards. Okay, so what that's going to effectively what that means is that the sort of fan base for that particular film is probably going to be double what it normally would be, because it's crossing into a genre of character studies that people like me, okay, I love those sort of things. People like me who wouldn't normally see a superhero film, probably apart from Harley Quinn. Okay, if you made a video about her, I'd watch that. Okay, so make a movie about her, I'll watch that. But apart from that, okay, I'm one of those fans of that. Alright, so the first thing I want to talk about is some of the influences. Now, a lot of reviews, and I've watched a lot of reviews so far, so they compare some of the movies to ones like the Scorsese films, and they've spoken about the Taxi Driver's influence. So my perspective, it's a little bit different. Okay, so I'm not sure whether you'll agree with me, so you'll just have to hear me out. Okay, so I guess for me, the age of cinema that I can relate to the most is probably a 10-year era that spans from about 1995 up to 2005. So for me, that was a time when I used to go to a lot of those independent cinemas. Okay, so I watched a lot of films. Okay, so I'll list the films. So Mulholland Drive, Requiem for a Dream, Donnie Darko, Vanilla Sky, The Machinist. Okay, so there's all of those sort of films. So that's a litany of films that that's probably left a big impression upon me. Okay, and that was an age that I can really identify with. Okay, so I thought that the Joker film was absolutely fantastic. I loved it. Okay, I dare say it's one of my favorite films, and it actually transported me back to that era of the cinema that I love. Okay, so one of the consistent themes that I'll be talking about is the kind of bending of reality. Okay, it's dreams versus delusion, and what we can trust when we see from the narrator, and what's false, so what's fantasy, what's real. Okay, so that's one of the things that really gets bent. So I see that in films like Requiem for a Dream, The Machinist, Vanilla Sky, okay, all those sort of things. Donnie Darko, I see a lot of that in there. Okay, so probably one of the biggest influences I can see so far. So when it comes to the character dynamics, especially the mother and son dynamic, okay, that's a really interesting part of the psychological study. So it's kind of reminiscent of the Hitchcock. So it's almost an adaptation of that Hitchcock, mother, so Psycho with the mother and son dynamic. Okay, so something really weird's going on there. And as the narrative unfolds, you sort of discover some secrets and you think, oh, that's really, really messed up. So there's a lot of sympathy we develop for this main character. Okay, now another part of it, so I'm just breaking apart a scene in which there's fantasy sequences. Okay, so when I think of Requiem for a Dream, now this is one that I cannot recommend enough. So if you like the Joker, so you like these sort of films, you must watch Requiem for a Dream. So there's a scene which is brilliantly done by Ellen Burstyn. So her character sort of goes into a downward spiral, a little bit similar, okay, but a lot different as well. So it's where she's watching the television and there's a charismatic host of a television show, and she has this sequence in which she's part of the show, okay, and she's done up. She looks a lot more beautiful than she sort of is, okay, because she looks very disheveled in this film. And then she's sort of hugging the producer, and the world is admiring her. Okay, so it kind of mirrors, and I can see a very similar sequence it's done in The Joker. It's done very beautifully. So there's a little bit of an influence that I see of that era of cinema, the Requiem for a Dream, those kind of dream sequences. So that's going to be one of the recurring themes that I talk about, is the blurring the distinction between fantasy and reality, delusion and reality, etc. So that's one of the constant themes that I see throughout this film. Okay, now the other thing that I sort of see, so The Machinist, which was done brilliantly by Christian Bale. Okay, so that's probably one of my favourite films that he's done. Okay, that's one of those films that also makes you question the narrative as well. So, what you see in front of the camera is not necessarily what's happening. So you see that there's a lot of hidden delusions going on. There's sort of the memory, dreams and reality, it gets blurred around a bit. But some of the sequences are sort of reminiscent of that type of acting, especially the body language, like the sort of dancing sequences, the contortion of the body. I can see that influence as well. Okay, so obviously that's the kind of era that I'm looking at that seems to have that influence. So I wonder if anyone else kind of noticed, some of those themes in there. Okay, so what I want to talk about is the main theme. Now, there's a whole discussion that we could have about the socio-cultural elements of the film. So we can talk about alienation and politics, etc. So yes, I agree with a lot of the comments that were made around that. For me, there's also a meta meaning as well. So as I've talked about, there's that kind of line between reality and fantasy. So one of the narrative tools which I really love is when we question the reliability of the narrator. Okay, so think about Gone Girl, where the one half of the story, we think we know what's happening, but when they shift the narrative to the storyteller or the narrator, there's a different story altogether. Okay, so we see throughout the film in some parts that what we've seen, on the camera, okay, being narrated, is not necessarily what's happening in reality. There's a few twists that happen throughout this film that make us suggest that maybe the narrator is not very reliable, and that's very consistent with the character of the Joker, because it's hard to establish a backstory because each one's going to be very different, because that's the nature of the character. And so maybe we don't know that the things happened in this film were actually true or not. Okay, so there's kind of a lot of Easter eggs that I want to talk about when it comes to that thing as well. So I believe one of the other meta things, the other themes of the film, is the duality. So it seems like there's two ideas that get presented, and sometimes they bleed into each other, so two opposing forces, but the distinction and the boundary between those forces gets contorted and gets blurred a bit. And there's a lot of visual symbolism I see behind that as well. Okay, so some of the examples are love and hate. Okay, so there's the old saying, there's a fine line between love and hate. So I see that with the relationship between mother and son. Okay, there's also reality versus delusion. Okay, those boundaries get blurred. There's good versus evil. So it's about dichotomies, but about how they blur into each other a lot of the time. All right, what I really want to talk about now, so this was probably my favorite part of the film, was, okay, apart from the acting, okay, apart from the story, apart from the direction, okay, I really want to talk about the artistic elements of the film. Okay, this is what really, I could spend a lot of time talking about this. Okay, one of the outstanding parts of this film is that the camera work is really rather minimal. So often, and I'm really getting impatient with those sort of films that continue to have this cut action, it's got to always be moving, There's all these CGI effects. In this particular film, the camera work is very, very slow. And so what that does is it enables the viewer to just take in the scenery. So it's taking in the performance of the actor, taking in the facial expressions, and looking at the scenery around, and you see these beautiful shots being done. Okay, that's what I love about this film. So what it reminds me of is being in a photographic art gallery where there's these beautiful photographs and the camera kind of pans backwards. It does that a lot so that we get to capture the scene. Okay, so there's a lot of things that we notice. So that's one of the techniques they use really, really well. Now, because the camera work is really quite slow throughout the movie, okay, once the action starts and once things really start to hit the fan, there's a change in that. So when we see scenes of action where there's a lot of jump cuts, that's really quite jarring because I feel like I've been lulled into this false sense of security. And when the action is started, like bam, it's very jarring because of the way the camera has been operating so far. Okay, I also want to talk about a technique that I saw in the film. It's something that I noticed over and over again. It was framing. It seemed like a lot of things were being placed in these artificial frames. So there was a lot of proportion, so it almost seemed like there was symmetry. So when I looked at a lot of the scenes which were sort of gradually panning back or people walking down, there was a sense of symmetry on both sides of the frame. What I also noticed was the artificial framing. So for example, the hospital, there was the archway frame. Okay, so that was always there. Now, the camera also panned back and there's also a frame around the characters. So for example, when he was walking through the hallways, there was always deliberately a rectangular frame that covered the characters like that. There was also a scene where they were panning back from watching the television. So the television had its own frame. But then as we were panning back, I saw another frame which was created by the walls. And I was sort of thinking to myself, wow, this is like watching a film inside of the film. So I'm not sure of the effect of that. So to me, it kind of represents a kind of meta thing going on. Okay, a kind of story inside of a story, a film inside of a film. And I think what that does is it kind of reinforces in my mind the kind of inaccuracy of the experience itself. So what we're seeing, might not be true. It might be just something made up. It might be a narrative within itself. Okay, because we know that maybe the narrator is not quite reliable because, what we see is sometimes seen as a fantasy sequence. So maybe the idea of framing it, saying there's a picture inside of a picture, maybe that feeds into that idea there. So it also sets up a symmetrical thing, so to contrast, okay? There's always shapes going on. There's arches, there's squares, there's rectangles. Okay, everything seems to be put into a frame, so maybe that's to try to give us a false sense of order. And so when things start to break down, okay, we start feeling a lot more disorientated because we're so used to having that. I also love the use of color. Okay, so it seems to be very contrasted with each other, and that's something that's really beautiful. So for instance, on one side of the frame, there's a lot of warm colors. Okay, so especially coming from a lampshade, so usually the oranges and yellows and maybe the light browns, there seems to be a lot of that very warm sort of coloring going on. But then usually on the side, there's something cold that comes out. Okay, so for example, opening up the refrigerator, there's kind of a bluish white sort of tinge. When the television is playing in the background, it's emanating sort of like the blue color. So I often see this splash of blue that's coming out, but it seems to be bounded. Okay, so there seems to be a distinction between those colors that's very tightly drawn. But then that gets contrasted with the use of color. So when he puts on his makeup, I guess for the final act to completely lose his mind, he applies his makeup in a way that there is still that boundary between colors, but that boundary is starting to get distorted a little bit. Okay, so for example, he put the blue makeup under his eye, but one was going down, one was going up, and there may have been tears that were kind of distorting the colors. So those colors are kind of melting into each other. So in contrast to before when there was order, where the colors were delineated in a geometric sequence, so very Apollonian, and then, towards the end, to represent that downward spiral, there's kind of a melting, especially with his face. Okay, a lot of it seems to melt into each other. Okay, so that's really what I want to talk about that. Now, there's also a lot of boundaries as well. So sometimes these geometric shapes which are superimposed upon the narrative itself, okay, it also seems to suggest a disconnection. So it seems like, so for example, there's an archway there, there's a window there, etc. So it seems to have some sort of disconnection. Now, even the wallpaper in the background, I'm even going to talk about that. Okay, so it's designed, what I see a lot of is the square patterns that are separated by lines. So it almost seems like the fragmentation of all these different things. Okay, so maybe it's the idea that everything is fragmented, that people are disconnected from each other, people don't care about each other. Now, one of my favorite scenes was at the end, after everything unfolded. Okay, there was a news report, and as we panned back, we saw heaps of monitors. So one monitor here, and then we go back, there's more monitors appear, and it seems like all these voices are talking to us at once, and it's the kind of fragmentation, so it kind of represents the difference of opinion. And so you got these people who are talking, and they might be saying, oh, this is horrible, this is tragedy, but at the same time, they're still disconnected from each other because they're separated by different monitors. Okay, so bleakly, we still seem to be separated and fragmented. So that's one of the themes in there. So I guess for me, on a larger scale, there is the socio-cultural issues that we can talk about. That sort of would belong in a lot of videos. So I'll probably do that if I do a live stream with somebody else like that. I'll probably talk about that. But for me, I guess the main theme that I really wanted to talk about was, I guess, the dichotomies and how things blur into each other. So how two competing forces can look the same. Okay, they can blur into each other, and you can see that in the way that the colors are delineated, and then they start melting into each other. Okay, once he puts on his makeup, so that seems to be very symbolic. Okay, and so I guess the other thing is the ambivalence. So sometimes you can hold sort of two emotions or two feelings together, and that's how I felt watching the movie. There's conflicting emotions. So on one hand, there's a sense of sympathy and empathy that I have towards the character, but on the other hand, there's a repulsion and a disgust towards that. So to be able to hold those two things together, it can make the viewer very uncomfortable with that. Okay, so I guess I want to talk a little bit about the critical reception, and I think this is a really sad state of the affairs when it comes to critical analysis in Hollywood. I feel it's really, really gone downhill probably over the last 10 years or so. I'm seeing an increased disconnect between the audience and the critics. Okay, so I can see the audience. Okay, it seems to be like the reviews that I'm seeing on YouTube. Okay, they're like very erudite reviews, but they seem to be really praising this film. It's left a deep impression upon us all. Okay, for many different reasons. So for me, it was an artistic reason. So the visuals and everything like that were really great for me, and for other people, it might have been the messaging. So the acting as well. Okay, so there's a lot of people who are getting appealed to. But then the critical reviews are a little bit different. Okay, so I think we need to somehow reconcile that. Like, there was a time where, you know, I don't like that elitism where it seems like there's this ivory tower of critics and there's the everyday moviegoers, and, you know, and people are intelligent. Okay, we're not sort of plebs or whatever that go along and see films and are easily amused, saying, oh, there's guns, there's titties, there's boobies and everything like that. Like, the movie-going audience is sophisticated. Okay, it wants to be challenged. It wants intelligence. Okay, cerebral experiences. We want those sort of things. I think that I have a lot of faith in the general public that they are very intelligent. Okay, and I've seen that myself. I've watched the YouTube videos. I've watched the reviews for this film, like very erudite analyses that I've seen towards this. One of the things, I guess, there's a certain language that comes out of these films. That were really cringeworthy. I think the reason why is because we're mistaking ideological association with criticism. Ideology and film criticism are not the same thing. Okay, I don't know where those two started bleeding into each other so often. Okay, it almost becomes to the point of dogma in which we're viewing a film through this really narrow sort of lens. And I really feel sorry for people who can only view it through those lenses. And there's also a lot of pearl clutching that goes on as well. I'm not for that. Okay. Now, when it came to the response, I think that the actor and director, they handled it perfectly. Okay. Because at the end of the day, you know, people have a right to ask questions. Okay. So when it comes to media conferences, you have a right to ask questions, but you're not entitled to that person's time. Okay. And you're not entitled for the actor or the director to indulge your ideology. Okay. So the idea that Joaquin Phoenix, he walked out of an interview because they were talking about, you know, are you concerned that this is going to fuel incel violence or whatever, something like that. You know, he walked out of there. And I think that's the best response. Okay, we've got to stop giving so much energy to these kind of parasitic ideological vampires who who probably haven't even watched the film, okay, who might not be interested in, but they're projecting their ideology into everything they consume. So I think that the response to that is good. And look, I remember the era of Oscar Wilde where he said, you know what, the artist is an artist. They're not obligated to be ethical. They're not obligated to tell an ethical story, to tell a socially conscious story or whatever. Okay, they're artists. They're there to produce a work of art, and the work of art stands alone to be appreciated, to be admired. So you either like it or you don't like it. So I think the response was perfect. And then I think more people need to do that, okay, because it seems like there's obviously a very shrill sort of thing going on in the background, okay, and I'm not really criticizing the left for that because I see a lot of that pearl clutching. I saw that with the Ghostbuster movie as well, the criticism of an all-female cast, and I was disappointed in that reaction as well, just that pearl clutching and that hysteria that goes around with that, and I just think, look, obviously the movie's not for you, okay, and that's the response that I say. So if people have got those concerns, they're saying, oh, why is this, this movie appeals, it's the violence that appeals to white males or whatever, and you know what, I just sort of think, well, this movie wasn't written for you. It's not written for anybody. It's written for the people who are going to enjoy it. That's the end of the story. Okay, now as I said before, I'm not really a film reviewer, so my analysis wouldn't be anywhere near as erudite. So I hope you enjoyed maybe some of the... for me, there's a lot of metaphors, there's a lot of imagery, so I've talked a lot about the artistry of the film. Okay, so I haven't really talked about the social aspects of the film, so that's probably best for a live stream where I can talk to other people and bounce ideas off each other. But just for me as well, it's not really something that I concern myself too much when I watch films. I'm not really looking at the morality behind a film. Like, I know that makes me a horrible person, but my politics and my morals and my art, I put those into two separate boxes. Okay, so I come from that decadent age of cultural appreciation. Alright, thank you very much for watching. So if you enjoy what I do, if you enjoyed this video and you'd like to see more of me, please press the subscribe button and please share me around the Twitter. Thank you for watching.